This video was brought to you by Skillshare. At the EU elections last month, Poland produced a very interesting and arguably overlooked set of results. In the end, there was less than a single percentage point difference between the vote share of Poland's two main political parties. Centrist Prime Minister Donald Tusk's Civic coalition, which won 37.1% of the vote, and the right-wing opposition Law and Justice Party, or PIS, which won 36.2%. Now, Tusk has spent the last few months purging members of the former PIS government from Poland's public institutions, but his radical reforms might actually have caused more problems than expected. After a dramatic start to the year which saw the arrest of two former PIS ministers hiding inside the presidential palace, Tusk has waged a total media clean-out and a complete judicial overhaul, putting all 17 regional public radio stations into liquidation and preparing more than a dozen PIS-installed judges for the sack. At the same time though, public support for the PIS has been steadily climbing, and it's now closing the gap on the Civic coalition. So in this video, we'll discuss the current state of Polish politics, why the PIS is creeping back up, and what might happen next.
Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos.
But first, let's start with some context. For decades, Polish politics has been a tug-of-war between two parties: the nationalist right-wing Law and Justice Party, or PIS, and the centrist Civic Platform Party. Now, the PIS led its first government from 2005 until 2007, but its rule was cut short by accusations of corruption and sexual harassment against its leader. When an early election was called in 2007, Tusk's Civic platform won with a solid majority. Tusk then served as Prime Minister until 2014, when he resigned to serve as the President of the European Council. But in the 2015 election, Civic Platform failed to produce a candidate as popular as Tusk, and it lost to the PIS, who governed for the next two consecutive terms until just last year. However, the PIS's rule was plagued by corruption allegations. In fact, in 2019, the former Speaker of Poland's lower house resigned over accusations that he took more than 100 personal flights on a government jet. A former finance minister was accused of having links to a criminal group, and the head of the central bank, a close friend of the PIS leader, was involved in a pay scandal surrounding two senior aides. The PIS also appointed party loyalists to key roles in the media and the courts, leading to widespread concerns about democratic backsliding. As a result, the EU blocked over €100 billion in funding for Poland, which was only released this February following Tusk's fulfillment of two so-called super milestones in order to strengthen judicial independence. However, while Tusk's reforms might have successfully appeased lawmakers in Brussels, it's not really done anything to settle Poland's long-standing political rivalry. Tusk's Civic coalition overtook the PIS as the single most popular party in mid-January, but in this time the PIS has crept back up and is now polling closely behind. But what's actually happened to close that gap? Well, there's a couple of interrelated issues here. The first is the fact that Tusk didn't have a huge mandate in the first place, and only formed his government with a very narrow majority, so the PIS always had a solid base to build support back up from. The second issue is that Tusk's coalition struggled with a lack of internal confidence, which frustrated the electorate. So let's take these issues one at a time, starting with Tusk's narrow majority. After the Polish election in October 2023, Tusk's multi-party Civic coalition had to team up with two other groups, the Third Way and the Left, in order to gain a narrow majority over Law and Justice, which otherwise had the biggest vote share. This means that the current government only really edged into power, and Tusk was always going to face a heavy pushback from PIS loyalists. While trying to implement his new democratic agenda, Tusk's government has been up against PIS-installed officials in institutions like the Constitutional Tribunal and the Presidential Palace, who've been kicking up a fuss and trying to block reforms. In fact, the current Polish president, for instance, is a former PIS candidate, and he's vowed to cause as much chaos as possible until the end of his term in 2025. Which basically means that Tusk has been trying to overturn a mountain, and some analysts now suggest that the Polish electorate is simply getting fed up with what they perceive as Tusk's ineffective and negative score settling, leading to rising support for the PIS. Now, the second problem is that Tusk's coalition, which awkwardly unites the left, right, and centre, just can't agree on things. This has led to a lot of stalling, which has made passing legislation even more difficult. For example, take Poland's ultra-conservative abortion laws. Poland is one of only 2 EU countries, along with Malta, to have almost no legal route to abortion. But while all parties in the governing coalition agree on liberalisation to some extent, they disagree on what extent it should be taken to. 2 parties in the government, namely the Civic coalition and the left, wanted to push for legal abortion rights up until 12 weeks of pregnancy, while the third way wanted to restore limited rights under Poland's abortion compromise from its 1993 family planning laws. Now, the government has apparently moved closer to the 12-week mark, but it's still months away from actually being passed into law. This stalled progress has also led to indecision on other issues like climate and energy policy, farmers' protests at the Ukrainian border, and the housing crisis. And because the coalition represents such a broad part of the electorate, there's a lot of variation in people's perception as to how effective they've actually been. Those on the left feel that progress on the rule of law is being made too slowly, while those on the right feel that the government's bold moves to dismiss judges and ignore the rulings of the Constitutional Tribunal are distracting it from delivering on its other promises. So now the European election has re-emphasized Poland's two-way political battle. What next for Tusk? Well, the results might not actually be as strong as Tusk would have liked. If he won a clearer majority, he would have been able to use the results to bolster his party's role in the coalition by pushing for bolder, more liberal reforms and continuing to purge Poland's institutions of PIS appointees. However, given this government only narrowly beat the PIS in June, Tusk's next few months in power are likely to be just as difficult, with continued infighting, legislative battles, and possibly even more compromise.
Running a profitable online news brand that gives away free content is a little tricky. So recently we launched an online store where you can purchase copies of our magazine, Too Long. The thing is, setting up an e-commerce business is also pretty tricky. But fortunately, when it comes to websites and e-commerce, Skillshare is there to help, with me taking their very useful course, Shopify Essentials for Web Developers, when setting up the store. That's because Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. That means that Skillshare can help take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. There's hundreds of career-focused classes. That's courses from how to start a business to maximizing your workflow or digital marketing. The best news is that the first 500 people to use our link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial to Skillshare. So get started today.